Wasn't guilt I saw in his eyes that evening. It was calculation. I've been around long enough to know the difference. 63 years will do that to a man. You learn to read faces the way you learn to read. Weather, not from books, but from getting caught in enough storms. My daughter had been dating Marcus. No, not Marcus. His name was Bryce Holloway. She'd brought him home 14 months before the wedding, and I remember thinking he had the handshake of a man who'd practiced it. Firm. 2 pumps. Eye contact held just a half second too long. The kind of handshake you learn in a seminar, not at a dinner table. My wife, Loretta, thought I was being too hard on him. You're suspicious of everyone she brings home, she said, and she wasn't entirely wrong. I'd scared off 2 perfectly decent young men in my daughter's 20s, with my silences and my questions. But this felt different. I couldn't explain it then. I just knew. My daughter's name is Nessa, short for Vanessa, though she's gone by Nessa since she was 4 years old and decided Vanessa was too many syllables for a little kid. She's 31. She teaches 3rd grade at an elementary school in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 40 minutes from the house she grew up in. She laughs too loud at her own jokes and cries at commercials, and once drove 2 hours in a snowstorm to bring soup to a sick colleague she barely knew. She deserved someone who loved her for exactly that. Bryce worked in commercial real estate. He was 36, good-looking in the way that photographs, well, but fade slightly in person. He'd grown up in Pittsburgh, went to Penn State, talked about his network and his pipeline the way men half his age talk about their dreams, like the words themselves were proof of something. He and Nessa met at a mutual friend's birthday party. She called me the next morning, which she always does when something matters. "Dad, I think I met someone. He's different." I told her I was glad and meant it, and filed away the word different for later. The first time Bryce and I were alone together, really alone, not just 2 men at opposite ends of a dinner table, was about 3 months into their relationship. Nessa had gone to the grocery store. We were sitting on the back porch of my house, the one I've owned for 26 years, the one Loretta and I bought when Nessa was 5 and her brother was 2. 3 acres outside of Lebanon, Pennsylvania. Old farmhouse, updated over the years. A detached workshop I built myself, apple trees along the back fence that my father helped me plant. I'd offered Bryce a beer, and he'd accepted, and we sat there watching the light go out of the sky, and he said, almost casually, "How many acres is this again?" I told him. He nodded slowly, looking out at the yard like he was appraising something. "Land like this is worth something out here. You ever think about what you'd do with it? Down the road, I mean, when it's too much to manage." I was 62 years old at the time and in perfectly good health. I told him I hadn't given it much thought. "Smart to start thinking about it," he said. "My dad waited too long with his place, made everything complicated later." I didn't say anything. I just watched him watch my land. Loretta died 11 months before Nessa's wedding. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless in the way that kind always is. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. Nessa was at the hospital every weekend. Her brother, my son, flew in from Denver and stayed for the last 3 weeks. Bryce came twice. I won't dwell on that. I made my peace with what it told me, and I've chosen to keep that to myself mostly. What I will say is that after Loretta was gone, things shifted. The house felt enormous in a way it never had before, even though it was the same house. I started going to bed early because there was nothing to stay up for. I started forgetting to eat until I was already too hungry. Small things. The kind of things that happen when the person who organized your life around you is suddenly absent. Bryce started calling more after Loretta passed. "Checking in," he said. Asking how I was doing, asking if I needed anything. Once he drove out on a Saturday morning, just the 2 of us, with coffee and pastries from a place in Harrisburg, and we sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours while he asked me questions about the house, about my retirement accounts, about whether I'd updated my will. He framed it as caring. He said, "Nessa worried about me." He said he just wanted to make sure I had everything in order, that families often left these things too late. I answered some of his questions and deflected others, and afterward I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time thinking about nothing in particular, the way you do when something is bothering you that you can't yet name. The engagement happened in March. Nessa called me, crying and laughing at the same time, and I drove to Harrisburg that evening and took them both to dinner and raised a glass and meant every word I said about wanting her to be happy. I liked Nessa happy. I'd spent 31 years trying to keep her that way. I wasn't going to stop now. The wedding was set for the last Saturday of September. Nessa wanted it at a restored barn venue outside of Gettysburg. The kind of place with string lights and wooden beams and a catering team that uses words like curated and seasonal. It was exactly what she'd always described wanting, and I was grateful she was getting it. The months between the engagement and the wedding were full of the ordinary chaos that weddings bring. Guest lists and catering tastings and debates about centerpieces. Bryce's family was small, his parents, a sister, a handful of cousins. His father was a quiet man named Alton, who shook my hand at the engagement party and said, "You got a good daughter," in the sincere way of someone who doesn't say things they don't mean. I liked Alton. I still do. It was about 6 weeks before the wedding when the first thing happened that I couldn't explain away. Nessa and Bryce had come out to the house for Sunday dinner, a habit we'd established after Loretta's death, mostly to make sure I was eating. After dinner, Nessa was cleaning up in the kitchen, and Bryce and I were in the living room, and he brought up the house again. He was good at bringing things up casually, like they'd just occurred to him. "Have you thought any more about the property?" he asked. "I've been running some numbers on what comparable parcels are going for out here. You might be surprised." I told him I wasn't thinking about selling. "Not selling," he said quickly, "just knowing your options. You've got equity sitting here. There are ways to leverage that, if you ever wanted to, without disrupting your retirement income. I know a guy who specializes in this. Agricultural land, legacy properties, really knows his stuff." I asked him why he was bringing this up. He smiled, and it was a good smile, practiced and warm. "I just want to make sure Nessa doesn't have to worry about you, that's all." Nessa appeared in the doorway then with a dish towel over her shoulder and looked at both of us and said, "What are you two talking about?" "Nothing," Bryce said. "Your dad was just telling me about the apple trees." I hadn't said a word about the apple trees. After they left that evening, I sat in the workshop for a while. I do my best thinking out there, among the sawdust and the smell of old wood. I thought about the handshake 14 months ago. I thought about how many acres is this again. I thought about the phone calls after Loretta. I thought about, I know a guy who specializes in this. I pulled out my phone and called my son in Denver. He's 38, works in civil engineering, has his mother's patience and my stubbornness, in proportions that mostly work out in his favor. I told him what I'd been noticing. The questions about the property. The suggestions about equity and leveraging. The way Bryce always circled back to the house, the land, my finances, my retirement. My son was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, have you talked to a lawyer?" I hadn't. I told him I felt like I was being paranoid. "Maybe you are," he said. "But there's no harm in making sure your paperwork is tight. Change your will if we need to. Make sure everything is spelled out clearly. Just protect yourself, Dad. That's not paranoid. That's just smart." I thanked him and hung up and thought about it for another week before I finally called the attorney who had handled our estate planning years ago. Her name is Gwen. She's been practicing for 30 years, and she has the kind of calm competence that makes you feel foolish for not calling sooner. I told Gwen what I'd observed. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "Tell me, has anyone asked you to sign anything, or suggested that you update your power of attorney?" I thought about it. "2 months ago, Bryce had mentioned, once, offhandedly, that Nessa had mentioned I might want to set up a durable power of attorney just in case. He'd said he knew a notary. It was simple. They could do it any time. I had brushed it off at the time. I told Gwen. She was quiet for a moment. "Don't sign anything," she said, "and let me do a little research." The week before the wedding, Gwen called me back. She had found something. Not criminal, not yet. But she'd looked into Bryce's professional history and found 2 prior instances where complaints had been filed against him with the Pennsylvania Real Estate Commission, one by an elderly client whose family claimed he had misrepresented the terms of a property sale. and one by a woman in her 70s who alleged that documents had been altered after she'd signed them. Both complaints had been settled quietly. His license was still active. She also told me that she'd reviewed the durable power of attorney language that Bryce had apparently, and I hadn't known this, already drafted and sent to Nessa for her review. Nessa hadn't mentioned it to me. The document would have given Nessa, and by extension Bryce as her spouse, broad authority over my financial and property decisions. I sat with that information for 3 days. I didn't tell Nessa. Not yet. I needed to think. I needed to be sure I wasn't about to blow up my daughter's wedding over a suspicion, over paperwork she might have thought was just responsible planning, over a man who might be entirely innocent of everything I was thinking. But I also knew what I knew. The wedding day arrived the way wedding days do, all at once, overwhelming and beautiful and moving too fast. The venue was exactly what Nessa had wanted. The barn was warm with October light and the smell of the dried flowers she'd spent weeks choosing. She looked more like her mother than I had ever seen her look. We had a father-daughter dance. She had chosen a song we used to listen to on long car trips when she was small. One of those songs that doesn't feel important until suddenly, it's the most important song you've ever heard. We were maybe a minute into it when I felt her slip something into the breast pocket of my jacket. Her hand was light and quick and deliberate. She pulled back and looked at me, and her eyes said something her mouth didn't. I kept dancing. I kept smiling. Inside, I felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. After the dance, I excused myself and found a quiet hallway near the restrooms and took out the folded paper she had put in my pocket. It was a napkin. She'd written on it in ink, her handwriting small and careful, like she'd written it ahead of time. Dad, I found the draft POA on his laptop 3 weeks ago. He told me it was your idea. I don't think you know about it. I don't know what to do. I'm scared. Please don't sign anything tonight. I love you. I read it twice. I put it back in my pocket. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a long time, looking at a framed black and white photograph of someone else's barn from 1947. Then I went and found Gwen. She was there as a guest. She and Loretta had been friends for 20 years, and I showed her the napkin, and she read it, and looked at me and said, I need to make a call. What happened next took about 45 minutes and felt like both an hour and 10 seconds simultaneously. Gwen reached a colleague who confirmed what we already suspected. There were documents, not just a POA draft, but a preliminary title transfer document for the house and the 3 acres, drafted by a real estate attorney Bryce had hired without my knowledge. The plan, as best as Gwen could reconstruct it, was that I would sign the POA at some point during the wedding weekend, in the celebratory fog of the event, framed as routine paperwork. Once the POA was in place, the property transfer could have been executed without my direct participation. This wasn't a hypothesis. This was a document trail. I have been many things in my life: a husband, a father, a carpenter, a man who makes his own furniture and tends his own trees and tries to be decent. I've also been a man who avoids confrontation when possible, who prefers quiet resolution to scenes. But I am also 63 years old, and I buried my wife 8 months ago, and no one was going to take the house she loved from the people she left behind. Found Bryce near the bar. He was laughing at something with one of his groomsmen. Jacket off, tie loosened, looking like a man who believed everything was already done. I asked if I could speak with him privately, just for a moment. We stepped out through a side door onto a wooden deck overlooking a field. The evening had turned cool the way Pennsylvania evenings do in late September. There were fireflies, which surprised me. I didn't think there were still fireflies this late in the year. I told him what I knew. Not everything, just enough. I told him I was aware of the POA. I was aware of the title document. I was aware of the complaints filed with the Real Estate Commission. I told him that Gwen, I called her my attorney, not by name, had already been in contact with the relevant parties, and that any attempt to execute any document related to my property would be challenged immediately and completely. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he smiled. The same practiced smile from the living room, the same smile from the first dinner, the same smile from every moment I dismissed as charm. "Jacques," he started, and I held up one hand. "My name is not Jacques," I said, "and we're done talking." I went back inside. I found Nessa by the dessert table, pretending to look at the cake. She saw my face, and she set down her plate, and we stepped outside onto the same deck I'd just left, and I held her while she cried, her wedding dress billowing slightly in the autumn wind. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said. "I found it, and I confronted him, and he said it was routine, that you'd asked for it, and I didn't believe him, but I wanted to. I really wanted to." "I know," I said. "I didn't want to ruin everything." "You didn't ruin anything," I said. "You saved it. What happened publicly was handled as quietly as we could manage." Nessa spoke to Bryce that night. His mother was there and Orton, and it was a conversation I wasn't part of, but that Nessa has described to me in pieces over the following months. He admitted, in that way people admit things when they've been cornered, which is to say partially and with heavy framing. He said it wasn't what it looked like. He said he'd been trying to help. He said a lot of things. Nessa said very little. She handed back her engagement ring on the way to the parking lot and asked him not to contact her. He didn't fight it. That, more than anything, told me what I needed to know about what he actually cared about. The guests were told there had been a family emergency. Most people, I think, suspected something, but no one asked directly. That's the thing about people. They will often extend the courtesy of not knowing if you offer them the option. Gwen filed a formal complaint with the Pennsylvania Real Estate Commission on my behalf the following Monday. I don't know what will come of it. These things take time. What I do know is that the documentation exists and that it won't be settled quietly this time if I have anything to say about it. It was a hard winter, the one that followed. Nessa stayed with me for 2 weeks in October, and we watched old movies and ate too much takeout and didn't talk about Bryce unless she wanted to, which was sometimes. She's been back in Harrisburg since November, teaching her third graders, driving her reliable old Subaru, calling me on Sunday mornings. She started seeing a therapist in January. She said it was helping. I started a new woodworking project in February, a rocking chair, something I've never built before. I'm taking my time with it. My father used to say that the furniture you make slowly is the furniture that lasts. The apple trees blossomed early this year. I walked out to look at them on a Tuesday morning in March and stood there for a while in the cold light, and I thought about Loretta, who used to cut those blossoms and put them in a jar on the kitchen windowsill. I thought about Nessa slipping that napkin into my pocket, one small, brave act in the middle of the worst night of her life. And the man who spent 63 years trying to protect the people I love. Most of the time, I probably got in the way more than I helped. But some days, you get it right. The house is still mine. The 3 acres are still mine. The apple trees are mine, and so are the blossoms, and so is the rocking chair, taking shape in the workshop, and so is every quiet Sunday morning with the phone ringing at 9 o'clock and my daughter's voice on the other end telling me about her week. Some things you hold on to.